Welcome to the next episode of Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is Tanya McCartney, CEO and Executive Director of the Bahamas Financial Services Board, and is responsible for all operations and strategy, including coordinating policy and regulatory initiatives for the financial services sector, drafting legislation, and collaborating with relevant public sector agencies to develop strategies for risk management and compliance. Tanya, delighted to have you here with us today, and thank you so much for joining.
The pleasure is mine. Welcome and greetings from the Bahamas.
Thanks, Tanya. So, Tanya, at the outset, can you give our listeners a quick overview of your professional career, starting with being Assistant Counsel at the Office of the Attorney General to your current role as CEO and Executive Director of the BFSB?
Sure, Shirish. I have had an interesting journey starting out as a UK trained barrister. So I am a barrister by profession, and I began my career working in the Office of the Attorney General in the Civil Division. In the Civil Division, I would have advised the various government ministries and departments, but I also worked in the International Unit, and we processed requests made under the mutual legal assistance treaties that we had with a number of countries, particularly the United States. So where they wanted information from financial institutions in the Bahamas, they would send a request to us. We would have to go to court, make an application and get an order, serve it on the financial institution, and request the records that they wanted in the United States. Of course, we had to ensure that they were not on a fishing expedition. And so this was my first exposure to financial services, international cooperation, working in that context. And I worked in that area for 3 years. And in 2000, the Bahamas was placed on a blacklist, and we had to pass a compendium of legislation to strengthen our AML and CFT laws. And it was at that point that I made a transition to the private sector. So no longer was I the one serving the orders. Sometimes I received an order. And my job was to make sure that we had controls in the financial institution to mitigate against having to get such orders, to make sure that we knew who our clients were, that we were monitoring them, that we reported when we had to report. And so I really became immersed in AML and CFT, and that was over 21 years ago. And during that time, I worked in our local, along with our compliance association, the Bahamas Association of Compliance Officers, and I served as president of that organization. Since then, I'm a lifelong learner. I have become a chartered banker, and I ran a subsidiary of a Canadian bank in the Bahamas. So I then moved from the compliance seat to the business seat. And so while I was trying to grow the book, my compliance people were asking me for the due diligence. So I've seen both sides of how compliance works, from the business to the compliance or AML side. And so I understand both well. Most recently, over the past 5 years, I've been serving as the CEO and Executive Director of the Bahamas Financial Services Board. This sort of brings together all of my experiences, the business side and the regulatory or compliance side, because now I have to work with policymakers to make sure that the Bahamas as a whole implements the international standards that are required of us, balancing business interests with compliance interests, as well as promoting the jurisdiction as a legitimate and responsible international financial center. So that is what I spend a lot of time doing, advocating for industry, collaborating with government, and telling our story as an international financial center.
Excellent. Thank you, Tanya. So could you also elaborate a bit on the roles and responsibilities of the BFSB as such, and what is maybe the larger role that plays?
Okay, so our name might suggest that we are a regulator. However, we're not a regulator. We have excellent relationships with them because we have to ensure that our members, I represent financial institutions. My membership of approximately 200 firms range from banks and trust companies to real estate firms, to law and accounting firms, all those who are classified as financial institutions for the purposes of AML and CFT. And so my job is to make sure that they stay abreast of changes in the regulatory environment, both locally and internationally, but also that their views are expressed to policymakers, because very often we have to implement these international standards, which has an impact on the way you do business. It impacts business models. And so we serve as a voice to make sure that policymakers understand potential impact and seek to balance those sometimes competing interests. So that is what I do. I travel a lot. I haven't made it as far as you, but maybe one of these days I will, telling this story, promoting the jurisdiction, letting people know of the various enhancements that we have made. Compliance as a whole is very broad. It's not just AML CFT. We know of the various initiatives coming out of the European Union around economic substance, around beneficial owner registers, the removal of preferential tax regimes. So we have to track all of those things that a compliance officer would come into contact with and have to make sure that their institutions comply with.
Excellent. Thank you, Tanya. And, we will look for an opportunity when we can get you here so that you can speak to some of the compliance associations here and share some best practices as well.
It will be my pleasure.
So, Tanya, the Bahamas are currently, in the FATF gray list as a result of the mutual evaluation in 2015, which identified strategic deficiencies. Can you take us through the current level of compliance and effectiveness with the FATF recommendations, as well as the follow-up or, let's say, remediation work that is underway, or any specific reforms that have been undertaken towards strengthening the integrity of the AML safety regime?
Yes, so I guess while the beauty of the Bahamas and our ideal location draws attention to us, sometimes our very geographic location causes us to be considered as high risk. We are right between North America and South America, the gateway to the Americas. And so by being where we are, developed countries, some of the ratings consider us to be vulnerable to certain activities that increase our risk profile. And this is something that we don't shy away from. What we have done is put in place controls. And so you are right. We were evaluated by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which is the regional style body of the FATF. And we received our report in 2017. And the report identified a number of strategic deficiencies as it relates to our compliance with the FATF's 40 recommendations. And we set about developing an action plan to address those deficiencies. Since then, the various regulators have established AML analytics units in their various departments. We passed a new Proceeds of Crime Act, which expanded the risk that could give rise to penalties. So we now speak of identified risks in our legislation. We no longer speak simply of money laundering and terrorist financing, because we have to take into account corruption and bribery, human trafficking, and all of those offenses that can give rise to financial crime. And so we have strengthened our legislative regime. We have allocated additional resources to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which was traditionally quite paper-based. They now have a lot of technology at their disposal. They have more analysts on staff. And so additional resources were allocated by the government to ensure that we address the concerns. And I would say that the concerns in that mutual evaluation report were really around enforcement. We had the laws in place. There were opportunities to refine them, but it was really around when you charge a person, for example, for fraud, for stealing by reason of employment. You might just charge them for that offense, as opposed to attaching to that an actual money laundering charge. And so we had to even change the way we did things from a legal perspective. With that said, today, the Bahamas is in very good standing in terms of our actual state of affairs vis-a-vis AML-CFT. We are 30, with respect to the FATF 40 recommendations, we are compliant with 30. We are largely compliant with 30. And we are partially compliant with 10. So with the bulk of the FATF's 40 recommendations, with 30 of them, we are either compliant or largely compliant. With the other 10, we are partially compliant. And we recognize that we are on par with some of the FATF member states in our level of compliance. The United States, Switzerland, Ireland. So we're meeting those requirements, but we're still on the list, as you know, and it has implications for us. The FATF itself, very early this year, recognized the progress that we had made. And they said that we had made tremendous strides, such that they wanted to conduct an on-site visit here in the Bahamas in April. We all know what happened in March. COVID-19 sort of hit all of us, and that precluded us from having the on-site examination by the FATF team to verify our compliance levels. And so that has disadvantaged us. Despite asking for a virtual on-site, that request has not been acquiesced to. And so we remain, I guess, as is, on the FATF gray list. But we are ready for them to come to conduct their on-site examination, because we are confident that we have taken the steps to address the deficiencies that were identified in the mutual evaluation. Yeah, and I would say to you that in addressing those deficiencies, public and private sector partnership was important. Very often when we think of compliance, we think of regulations, laws, policy, but it's very important for the public sector and private sector to work together. So we have a national AML-CFT committee, and private sector was a part of that, so that when we discuss changes in laws, the business is right there to give their input as well.
Right. So, Tanya, as you mentioned, that the current state is that, you are as compliant as anyone could be, especially, the countries that you mentioned. So on that note, at a global level, do you think that the FATF process for mutual evaluation and ranking of countries is democratic, especially since many countries would have fewer resources, whether it's in terms of funds or trained professionals or access to technology? So should all countries be painted with the same sort of evaluation brush, or should there be different methodologies for different countries, who have different challenges, so that you're not unfairly positioned on the global financial stage? What's your view on this?
It's so easy to say that a process is undemocratic or is not fair, okay? Oh, look at us. And perhaps there's an element of unfairness to it. But for years, the Bahamas as a jurisdiction has been asking for a level playing field. We think that it's good that everyone is held to an identifiable standard. The challenge is to ensure then that everybody has to apply to that standard. And so we advocate for a level playing field. Let all of us play by the same rules, so that we can compete then on service, that we can compete based on the products that we offer. And so we won't lament whether it's a fair or democratic process. What we'll ask for is a level playing field. Let the same rules apply to the Bahamas, apply to India, apply to the United Kingdom, and apply to the United States. And then we can truly compete.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, Tanya, are there any practical difficulties that banks or any other reporting entities in the Bahamas face while complying with reporting requirements and implementation of the right AML frameworks within the institution? And what efforts are regulators doing to play a dual role, regulatory as well as developmental, to shepherd these entities to comply better?
You touched on some of them in your earlier comments. It takes tremendous resources. You have to invest in technology. You have to invest in staff training. You have to hire the right talent, which can sometimes be expensive. And you may have to adjust your business model, which might impact profitability. And so those are some of the practical challenges. But I am pleased to say that we have a very collaborative environment here in the Bahamas, where our regulators, be it the Central Bank of the Bahamas or the Securities Commission or the Insurance Commission, all of them, there is ongoing dialogue and collaboration. And so very often we get to discuss the pain points before the regulation is implemented. So the laws and the regulations are not just thrusted upon us. When they are drafted, we get to view them, provide feedback, discuss what the implications are for us. And I think collaboration is critical in easing some of those challenges that financial institutions may encourage. We have an excellent model here, and I think BFSB as an organization helps to facilitate that type of ongoing dialogue. So it's hard to be in the compliance world, and I think our regulators understand that, and they know that financial institutions are there to make money, but you have to play by certain rules. And so we dialogue, and they assist us by facilitating training themselves. They very often host briefing sessions and training sessions, so it's not just left to the financial institution. Our Central Bank of the Bahamas annually hosts an AML CFT conference. We were scheduled to have one this year, which was going to be quite big, but we all know what happened there. But annually, there is a very large conference supported by financial institutions that is facilitated by the Central Bank of the Bahamas.
Excellent. So Tanya, in closing, what would you say is the position of banks and obviously all of the reporting entities in the country on the increased regulation and efforts to prevent financial crime in the Bahamas or going through the Bahamas?
There is a commitment to adhering to the highest possible standards. Why? Because if one financial institution in your jurisdiction gets it wrong, it impacts the reputation of the entire jurisdiction. Wherever you are viewing this, if you're in Bangladesh, if you're in India watching this, if one entity gets it wrong, it's a black eye on the entire country. And they're not going to say, they may say XYZ Bank had a breach or didn't or facilitated money laundering, but it's going to paint the whole country as facilitating that type of activity. And so in the Bahamas, we recognize that the jurisdictional perception is critical. And so there is a collective responsibility, a collective acknowledgement of the need to adhere to the highest possible standards in the best interest of the financial system.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tanya, for being here with us today. And it was indeed a pleasure and actually very heartening to listen to you, speak today. It, I think, continues to give me the confidence that, there is hope for the compliance.
And I didn't put a plug in, but I will put a plug in
Sure.
now. At the end of 2019, I actually published a book.
Okay.
It's called Strategies for Success, a Road for the Compliance Professional in Financial Services. And the book shares my experiences, and it outlines a few scenarios that a compliance professional may encounter on the job. You may not think that an account should be opened, but the MD and the relationship manager is pushing you to do it. What do you do then? You may think that a suspicious activity report should be filed, and there is some reticence in doing that. How do you handle these difficult dilemmas that compliance professionals face every day? And I thought it was good to share some of my experiences and give you a little, secret weapon on how to handle these situations. And so check the book out, it's online, and I hope you find it useful.
Absolutely. I think I'll put the link to the book when we send this edition out so that people can actually click through and take a look at it. And yes. When I get my copy, when we meet, you've got to sign that copy for me.
Absolutely. This has been such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you on Fintelekt Friday.
Thank you so much.